In early February of the year 1972, Iran experienced one of the deadliest blizzards in recorded history. It was a disaster that no one saw coming. And when the snow started falling, no one expected it to last as long as it did. For nearly a week, the storm raged on, covering entire regions of the country in thick layers of snow. By the time it was over, more than 4,000 lives had been lost, and entire villages had been wiped off the map. This devastating blizzard hit after 4 years of drought, a period when Iran had been struggling with dry conditions and failing crops. People had grown used to mild winters, so when the snow began to fall, there was little concern at first, but this was no ordinary snowfall. The storm system brought relentless blizzards that buried parts of northwestern, central, and southern Iran under more than 25 feet of snow. Entire communities disappeared overnight, their homes and streets swallowed by towering snowdrifts. The hardest hit areas included villages in southern and western Iran, where many people lived in rural communities that were ill-equipped for extreme winter weather. The village of Shaklabad, near the border with Turkey, was one of many that suffered a terrible fate. Over 100 people lived there, but when rescue workers eventually arrived, they found no survivors. It was as if the village had never existed, buried beneath the crushing weight of snow and ice. At first, people assumed the storm would pass quickly, but as the days went on, conditions only worsened. Temperatures dropped to extreme lows, reaching negative 25 degrees Celsius. Roads were quickly buried, cutting off access to entire regions and leaving thousands of people stranded. With no way to bring in food or medical supplies, many people were left to face the storm on their own. Those who ran out of firewood and fuel had no way to stay warm. Homes became ice-cold traps, and for many, survival was impossible. In some areas, avalanches swept down mountain slopes, destroying anything in their path. The Shalu Road, a key route through the mountains, was completely buried, stranding hundreds of travelers. Power lines snapped under the weight of the snow, leaving entire towns in darkness. With communication lines down, it was nearly impossible for authorities to understand the full scale of the disaster. The Iranian government struggled to respond, and rescue efforts were slow to get underway. As the storm continued, fear and desperation spread. People trapped in their homes had no way of knowing if help would come. Some attempted to dig their way out, but with snowdrifts reaching the roofs of buildings, it was nearly impossible. Others huddled together, burning whatever they could find to keep warm. But as supplies ran out and the temperatures remained dangerously low, the situation became more and more dire. The Iran blizzard of 1972 was not just a storm, it was a catastrophe unlike anything the country had seen before. And as the days passed, the death toll continued to rise. As the blizzard raged on, Iran's remote villages and towns found themselves completely isolated from the outside world. Heavy snowfall had blocked every major road, making travel impossible. Trains stopped running, buses were stranded, and even military vehicles could not push through the towering drifts. In some places, the snow was so deep that it buried entire houses, leaving only rooftops visible. People trapped inside had no way to escape and no way to call for help. The lack of communication made the situation even worse. Telephone lines had collapsed under the weight of ice and snow, cutting off entire regions from government aid. In rural areas, where radios were scarce, families had no idea how widespread the disaster was, or when rescue teams might arrive. Villagers who attempted to reach nearby towns quickly realized that the deep snow made travel impossible. Many who ventured out never returned, succumbing to the brutal cold and exhaustion. One of the most tragic aspects of the blizzard was its impact on those already struggling with illness. A flu outbreak had been spreading through rural Iran in the weeks before the storm. Once the blizzard hit, medical supplies became nearly impossible to deliver. Those who had fallen ill before the storm found themselves completely cut off from doctors or hospitals. With temperatures plunging to negative 25 degrees Celsius, even the healthiest individuals were at risk of hypothermia and frostbite. In the province of Azerbaijan, the snowfall was so extreme that it completely buried at least 200 villages. One of the hardest hit areas was the village of Sheklab, home to around 100 residents. When rescue teams finally reached the village days later, they discovered a grim reality: no one had survived. The entire community had been wiped out, frozen beneath layers of ice and snow. Throughout the affected regions, the weight of the snow caused buildings to collapse. In cities like Hamadan and Tabriz, people became trapped inside their homes as walls and roofs gave way. Those fortunate enough to still have access to food and heat rationed their supplies carefully, unsure of how long the storm would last. Schools, businesses, and government offices shut down, and entire cities came to a standstill. Despite the chaos, there were incredible acts of bravery. Some individuals risked their lives to help others, digging through the snow in search of survivors or delivering supplies to neighbors in need. Rescue workers struggled against the extreme conditions, using helicopters to drop food and medical aid to areas that could not be reached by land. However, with visibility near zero and wind speeds making flying dangerous, even these efforts were often unsuccessful. The blizzard was relentless, showing no signs of letting up. As more and more communities were buried under the snow, the death toll continued to climb. For those still trapped, the only hope was that the storm would finally pass before it was too late. As the days passed, the situation across Iran became even more desperate. The sheer scale of the blizzard left authorities overwhelmed, and with roads buried under towering snowdrifts, the government struggled to coordinate rescue and relief efforts. Entire regions remained cut off, and reports of worsening conditions trickled in from the few areas that still had working communication. In the mountainous areas of western Iran, avalanches became a new and deadly threat. As the weight of the snow pressed down on unstable slopes, massive walls of ice and debris crashed down onto villages and roadways. In some cases, entire communities were wiped out in seconds, buried under tons of snow, before they even had a chance to react. The Shalu Road, a critical passage through the mountains, was completely blocked, stranding travelers with no way forward or back. In the province of Gilan, the situation was equally dire. Villages along the Caspian Sea coast were buried under layers of snow that had never been seen before in the region's history. The storm had arrived so suddenly that many people were caught outside when temperatures plummeted. Those who were unable to find shelter quickly froze to death. The relentless wind made it nearly impossible to see, turning simple movements into life-threatening challenges. With food supplies dwindling, many families were left with impossible choices. Some attempted to dig tunnels through the snow to neighboring homes in search of food or firewood, only to become disoriented and lost. Others burned whatever they could find, furniture, clothing, even parts of their homes in a desperate attempt to keep warm. In some cases, people huddled together for warmth, hoping to survive until help arrived. The storm also took a devastating toll on livestock and agriculture. In rural Iran, where many communities depended on farming for survival, entire herds of sheep and cattle perished in the cold. The loss of so many animals meant that even after the snow melted, food shortages would continue for months. Farmers who had already suffered through the years of drought now faced yet another catastrophe, as the weight of the snow destroyed storage buildings, crushing what little grain and supplies they had left. Efforts to deliver aid were met with significant challenges. Helicopters attempted to drop supplies into snow-covered regions, but high winds made flying dangerous. When pilots did manage to get close to affected areas, they found it nearly impossible to locate survivors. From above, many villages appeared as nothing more than smooth, unbroken fields of white, with no sign of life beneath. In some cases, rescue teams only realized they had flown over a buried settlement when they saw small holes in the snow, desperate attempts by survivors to dig their way out. As the storm dragged on, temperatures continued to drop. In some of the hardest hit regions, thermometers registered temperatures as low as negative 25 degrees Celsius. For those still trapped beneath the snow, the chances of survival were dwindling by the hour. The Iranian government declared a national emergency, but even with international offers of assistance, getting help to those in need remained nearly impossible. The full extent of the disaster was still unknown, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This was no ordinary blizzard. This was a natural disaster of historic proportions, one that would leave a lasting impact on Iran for years to come. As the blizzard raged on, the full scale of the disaster became more apparent. The relentless snowfall showed no signs of stopping, and the freezing temperatures made any attempts at rescue increasingly difficult. In the hardest hit areas, people were running out of options. With food supplies gone and no access to clean water, survival became a battle against time. In villages that had not been completely buried, those who could still move attempted to dig tunnels through the snow in search of supplies or help. But the sheer depth of the snowfall, reaching over 25 feet in some places, made these efforts nearly impossible. Many who ventured out never returned, either lost in the blinding snow or overcome by exhaustion and the cold. Emergency responders worked tirelessly, but their efforts were severely limited. Helicopters attempted to fly over buried villages to drop supplies, but strong winds and heavy snowfall made navigation dangerous. Some pilots reported flying over areas that should have been populated, only to see nothing but vast expanses of white. With entire communities erased from sight, the challenge was not just delivering aid, it was finding the people who needed it. In some cases, desperate survivors attempted to signal for help. Those who still had access to rooftops climbed onto them, waving sheets or anything brightly colored in hopes of being spotted. Others burned whatever they could to create smoke signals. But with visibility near zero for much of the storm, many of these efforts went unnoticed. The human toll was devastating, but the impact of the storm extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. In major cities like Tehran, daily life had come to a complete halt. Roads were blocked, businesses were shuttered, and transportation was paralyzed. The closure of Iran's main airport meant that even international aid struggled to arrive in a timely manner. Supplies were running low, and the sense of isolation only added to the fear gripping the nation. Outside the cities, medical crises worsened. Those who had been injured in avalanches or collapsed homes had no way to reach hospitals. And with many doctors trapped by the snow themselves, medical care was nearly non-existent. The flu epidemic that had already begun spreading before the blizzard only made matters worse, as weakened immune systems struggled against the freezing temperatures. In many cases, people who had survived the initial impact of the storm succumbed days later due to exposure, starvation, or untreated illnesses. The Iranian military was eventually called in to assist, but even their resources were stretched thin. Soldiers fought their way through snow-covered roads, using whatever equipment they had to clear pathways and search for survivors. Some towns received much-needed provisions, but for many areas, it was too little, too late. The sheer magnitude of the disaster had overwhelmed the country's ability to respond. Despite the tragedy, stories of resilience emerged. In some villages, neighbors worked together to keep each other alive, pooling resources and taking turns digging through the snow in search of food. In Tehran, volunteers braved the elements to bring supplies to those who were stranded. People who had lost everything found comfort in the kindness of strangers, proving that even in the face of one of the worst blizzards in history, the human spirit remained unbroken. As the storm finally began to subside, rescue workers prepared to assess the true scale of the devastation. But what they would uncover in the days that followed would shock the world and cement the 1972 Iran blizzard as one of the deadliest snowstorms in recorded history. As the blizzard finally loosened its grip on Iran, the nation was left in a state of shock. The skies cleared, and for the first time in over a week, sunlight revealed the full scale of destruction. Entire villages had been wiped off the map, buried under towering snowdrifts. Roads and railways, once the lifelines of transportation, were unrecognizable. It was a disaster unlike anything the country had ever experienced. Rescue teams and volunteers moved quickly, working through the frozen landscape to search for any remaining survivors. In some places, people were found clinging to life inside their homes, having survived on melting snow and whatever food they had managed to save before the storm. But in far too many villages, the news was grim. As workers dug into the thick snow, they uncovered frozen bodies, entire families who had perished together, unable to escape the relentless cold. One of the hardest hit regions was the village of Sheklab. Rescuers who finally arrived found no signs of life. Out of its 100 residents, not a single person had survived. This was a devastating pattern across western Iran, where an estimated 200 villages were erased, their populations lost beneath the snow. Some settlements were so completely buried that they were never rebuilt. The government, heavily criticized for its slow response during the blizzard, ramped up its recovery efforts. Helicopters dropped supplies to isolated areas, and teams worked around the clock to clear roads and restore electricity. International aid began to arrive with supplies and financial assistance from various countries. However, the scale of the disaster was so immense that relief efforts could not keep up with the level of devastation. Many families who had lost their homes were forced to take shelter in makeshift camps, relying on aid for survival. As days turned into weeks, the melting snow revealed the true extent of the damage. Homes and buildings that had withstood the weight of the snow were now at risk of collapse due to water damage. Farmland was destroyed, adding to the hardship for those who relied on agriculture for their livelihood. The economic toll on Iran was severe, as trade and transportation had been halted for an extended period. In rural areas, the loss of entire communities meant that reconstruction would take years, if not decades. Beyond the physical destruction, the emotional and psychological impact of the blizzard lingered. Families mourned the loss of loved ones, and survivors carried the trauma of their experiences for the rest of their lives. For those who had been trapped for days, the feeling of helplessness and fear was something they would never forget. In the years that followed, the Iran blizzard of 1972 was studied by meteorologists and disaster response experts. Scientists examined how a storm of such magnitude had developed so suddenly, while government officials looked at how future disasters could be handled more effectively. The blizzard became a harsh lesson in the importance of preparedness, leading to improvements in Iran's emergency response systems. Decades later, the memory of the storm still lingers. It remains the deadliest blizzard in recorded history, a tragedy that claimed over 4,000 lives and changed the course of many more. Even today, older generations in Iran remember the fear and devastation it brought, passing down stories of survival and loss to younger generations. The villages that disappeared beneath the snow serve as a reminder of nature's immense power and the fragility of human life in the face of such force. Though time has moved forward, the legacy of the 1972 Iran blizzard remains. It was a disaster that reshaped communities, tested the resilience of a nation, and left behind a stark warning of how quickly nature can turn deadly. It was a calm Sunday afternoon in Peru on the 31st of May, 1970. Around 3:20 in the afternoon local time, people were going about their day. Some were relaxing after lunch, others were at church, and many in coastal towns like Chimbote and Kazma were finishing their weekend chores. But without warning, the ground began to shake, hard. The shaking lasted just under 1 minute, around 45 seconds in total, but what it left behind was absolute devastation. The earthquake struck off the coast of north-central Peru, about 25 kilometers west of the port city of Chimbote in the Pacific Ocean. The area where the quake started is part of a dangerous geological zone where the Nazca tectonic plate is slowly moving under the South American plate. This is what geologists call a subduction zone, and it's known for producing powerful earthquakes. On that day, the tectonic stress reached its breaking point, and the result was a massive undersea quake with a moment magnitude of 7.9. Even though the epicenter was out in the ocean, the quake's effects were felt across a massive area, roughly 83,000 square kilometers. That's an area larger than the size of Belgium and the Netherlands combined. It wasn't just Peru that felt it either. Parts of Ecuador to the north felt the tremors, and even western Brazil, deep in the Amazon, reported some shaking. From Tumbes in the north to Iquitos in the east and down past Pisco, the entire country was shaken. In Peru's capital, Lima, located over 400 miles from the epicenter, buildings swayed and people panicked. The shock even caused damage in parts of Trujillo, the third largest city in the country, although it was less severe there. The worst damage was concentrated in two regions, Ancash and southern La Libertad. These regions include the rugged Andes Mountains, as well as towns and villages along the coast. And here's the thing, this earthquake didn't just cause buildings to fall, it set off one of the most terrifying chain reactions in modern history. The power of the shaking triggered something even deadlier than the quake itself, but that part comes later. For now, in the immediate aftermath of the tremors, entire towns were left in rubble. Homes made of adobe bricks, which are common in the region, crumbled instantly. These structures aren't built to withstand strong quakes, especially on unstable soil, which many of these towns were built on. The combination was deadly. Phone lines were down, roads cracked open or were completely blocked by debris. The Pan American Highway, which runs through the region and is a major lifeline for transportation and aid, was heavily damaged. That alone would cause major problems in the hours to come, especially when it came to getting help to where it was needed most. People ran into the streets, many barefoot and still in their Sunday clothes, trying to find family members, help neighbors, or just understand what had happened. In some towns, nearly everything was flattened. In places like Carhuaz and Recuay, between 80 to 90% of buildings were destroyed. Hospitals, schools, water lines, power stations, gone. It was more than just destruction, it was complete infrastructure failure. This was not just a local emergency, it was a nationwide crisis. The Peruvian government scrambled to get information, but communication systems were barely functioning, and no one knew yet just how bad things really were in the mountain valleys to the east, especially in a place called Yungay. In the hours that followed, aftershocks rumbled through the region, keeping people on edge. The fear wasn't just about the shaking continuing, it was about what would come next. Because while the earthquake was terrible on its own, it was only the beginning of what would become the worst natural disaster in Peru's history. In the hours following the earthquake on the 31st of May, 1970, the scale of the disaster was still unclear. Communication systems were down across much of northern and central Peru, and entire towns were cut off. But as word slowly spread, it became clear that something even worse had happened in the highlands, specifically in the area near Mount Huascaran, the tallest mountain in all of Peru. Mount Huascaran stands more than 22,000 feet above sea level and is covered in glaciers year-round. When the earthquake hit, it sent powerful vibrations through the mountain's northern face. That pressure caused a massive section of rock and ice to break loose. What began as a fracture quickly turned into a roaring avalanche, one of the deadliest in human history. The falling mass of glacial ice, snow, rock, and debris formed what's known as a debris avalanche. It started high up on the mountain in a steep and heavily glaciated area. Within seconds, a wide chunk of the slope, over 900 meters across and 1.5 kilometers long, ripped free. As it tumbled downhill, it picked up speed fast. It wasn't just falling, it was racing. Estimates say it moved at more than 280 kilometers per hour and may have reached speeds over 330 kilometers per hour as it descended. By the time it neared the valley below, this avalanche had turned into a deadly wave of ice, rock, mud, and snow. It carried an estimated 80 million cubic meters of material. That's enough to fill over 30,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And it was heading straight for the village of Yungay. Yungay was a peaceful town located in the Callejon de Huaylas Valley. Before the earthquake, it was home to about 20,000 people. The town sat beneath Mount Huascaran's looming peak, and many residents believed the snow-covered mountain was a symbol of protection. But on that day, the mountain became the very thing that destroyed them. When the avalanche reached Yungay, it hit with such force that it buried the entire town in a matter of seconds. Homes, streets, cars, and families were all swept away. Some people tried to run, but there was almost no time. The only survivors were those who happened to be in the town's cemetery, located on a small hill that the avalanche didn't reach, and a few children who had been taken to a stadium just outside the town. Nearby, the village of Ranrahirka was also hit. It had already been partially destroyed by a previous avalanche 10 years earlier in 1960. Now it was struck again, and this time, the destruction was even worse. Entire communities vanished beneath the wave of debris. It wasn't just the physical destruction that made this avalanche so deadly. The volume of snow and rock, combined with the incredible speed and weight, meant that few structures, if any, could withstand the impact. And because the avalanche happened so quickly after the earthquake, there was no warning system, no alert, and no way for people to get to higher ground in time. In the days that followed, rescue teams struggled to reach Yungay. Roads were gone, power lines were down, and even air rescue was difficult due to poor visibility and blocked terrain. When they finally reached the site, they found what looked like a wasteland. No sign of the town, only a thick blanket of mud and rocks covering everything. The Peruvian government later declared the area where Yungay once stood a national cemetery. Digging and excavation were not allowed, both out of respect for the thousands who died and because recovery was nearly impossible. Families were left without closure. Entire generations were lost. The avalanche wasn't just a result of the earthquake, it was also a reflection of how vulnerable mountainous regions can be, especially when glaciers and unstable slopes are involved. Mount Huascaran had long been a stunning natural landmark, but that day it became the center of a disaster that would leave a permanent scar on Peru's history. As the nation tried to grasp the tragedy, attention began to shift toward the larger picture. What had happened across Ancash and La Libertad was far more than just a series of collapsed buildings. It was a complete breakdown of entire communities. Next, we'll look at the wider impact across the country, including the humanitarian crisis that followed. After the earthquake and the avalanche devastated the regions of Ancash and La Libertad on the 31st of May 1970, Peru found itself facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in its history. The destruction was so widespread that entire districts were isolated and help was slow to arrive. The country was in shock, but in the days that followed, the focus shifted toward rescue, recovery, and survival. More than 83,000 square kilometers had been affected. That's an area larger than the size of many countries, including Belgium. The destruction reached far beyond Yungay and the nearby towns. In fact, reports of damage came from as far north as Tumbes and as far south as Pisco. The tremors were felt as far east as Iquitos, deep in the jungle. Even some parts of western Brazil and southern Ecuador reported mild shaking. In the coastal city of Chimbote, which was one of the largest urban centers in the region, nearly 90% of buildings were destroyed. The port was heavily damaged and fishing operations came to a halt. Nearby cities like Casma, Arme, and Soup also saw entire blocks flattened. These were not just homes, these were schools, hospitals, government buildings, and markets. Nothing was spared. Up in the mountains, the damage was just as severe. In places like Carhuaz, Reque, and Ija, the quake wiped out nearly all infrastructure. In many areas, adobe brick homes simply crumbled. These buildings had no reinforcements and weren't built to handle seismic activity. That made them especially dangerous, and thousands of people were crushed beneath the rubble. Transportation came to a standstill. The Pan American Highway, Peru's main coastal road, was cut off in multiple locations. This slowed down aid and made it nearly impossible to reach certain towns quickly. In the Santa River Valley, the Cañon del Pato hydroelectric plant was damaged, causing blackouts and cutting power to large parts of the region. The railway that connected Chimbote to the interior was also ruined. About 60% of that rail line became unusable overnight. By the second day, the Peruvian government began to understand how serious the situation really was. But with communication lines down and many towns still unreachable, organizing rescue efforts was incredibly difficult. Military helicopters were sent to drop food and supplies where they could, but the demand was overwhelming. Survivors were digging through rubble with their bare hands, hoping to find loved ones or recover anything that had been spared. International aid began pouring in almost immediately. Countries from around the world offered support. The United States played a major role, and First Lady Pat Nixon even traveled to Peru herself. She brought relief supplies, visited hospitals, and helped bring attention to the needs of the people affected by the disaster. Planes filled with food, medicine, blankets, and rescue equipment arrived in Lima and were transported north as quickly as possible. But even with global support, recovery was slow. The scale of the destruction made logistics a nightmare. There were not enough vehicles, fuel, or equipment to get aid where it was needed fast enough. Some towns went without help for days. People were sleeping in the open, drinking unsafe water, and struggling to find food. Diseases began to spread, especially among children and the elderly. In many places, local communities stepped up, farmers donated crops, churches opened their doors, and volunteers helped coordinate aid drops. But the trauma ran deep. Families had been wiped out, homes were gone, entire neighborhoods had simply vanished. As days turned into weeks, the country faced another painful reality: the economic cost. Estimates put the losses at more than $500 million, a devastating figure for Peru at the time. Industries shut down, jobs disappeared, and with thousands of people displaced, there was a growing need for long-term shelter and support. Despite the destruction, the people of Peru showed incredible resilience. There were acts of courage, unity, and compassion that stood out amid the devastation. Still, it was clear that recovery would take years, not months. As we wrap up, we'll explore how Peru responded in the years after the disaster, the changes made to laws, safety standards, and disaster preparedness, and how the tragedy left a lasting legacy, not just in Peru, but around the world. In the years after the Ancash earthquake of May 31st, 1970, Peru slowly began the long process of rebuilding. The disaster had not only shaken the ground, but had also exposed deep weaknesses in how the country prepared for natural catastrophes. What came next was a period of reflection, reform, and an effort to make sure a tragedy of that scale would never happen again. One of the most immediate and permanent decisions made by the Peruvian government was to preserve the site of Yungay. The town had been completely buried under millions of cubic meters of mud, rock, and ice, and recovery was impossible. The government declared the area a national cemetery. No excavation was allowed. The ruins, frozen in time, became a place of remembrance. Only a few landmarks remained above the surface, including the top of the church and a handful of palm trees. Those who had survived, mostly children who had been at the stadium on higher ground, were relocated, and the town was never rebuilt. The disaster left such a deep mark on the country that in the year 2000, Peru officially established May 31st as Natural Disaster Education and Reflection Day. On this day, schools across the country practice earthquake drills and learn about what happened in 1970. The goal is to pass on the memory of the event and to teach new generations how to react if it ever happens again. It became a part of the country's identity, an annual reminder of both loss and resilience. In terms of policy, building codes in Peru were updated. Before the earthquake, many structures had been made from adobe and lacked reinforcement. After seeing how quickly these buildings crumbled, especially in rural areas, new regulations were introduced. The government pushed for safer construction methods, especially in earthquake-prone regions. Over time, cities began replacing old infrastructure and investing in materials better able to withstand seismic activity. The tragedy also led to improvements in emergency response systems. Before 1970, there had been little coordination between military, medical, and civil services during disasters. The chaos in the days after the quake made it clear that this needed to change. The Peruvian government created new emergency management agencies, set up plans for disaster zones, and invested in training programs for search and rescue teams. Globally, the event had a lasting impact on how landslides and avalanches were studied. The Huascaran avalanche became a case study in high mountain risk zones. Scientists around the world studied what had happened in Peru, analyzing the speed and force of the debris flow that had destroyed Yungay. It helped researchers understand how rock and ice can mix to form incredibly deadly slides. This knowledge would later be used in other mountainous countries like Nepal, Pakistan, and parts of the Alps to monitor glacial areas for signs of collapse. The earthquake also pushed forward conversations about early warning systems. In 1970, Peru had no seismic warning system in place. People had no idea what was coming. Since then, countries across Latin America and around the world began investing in seismometers and alert networks. These systems are now able to detect early tremors and give people seconds or even minutes to prepare. Though Peru has faced other earthquakes since then, none have matched the sheer scale of the Ancash disaster. More than 50 years later, it remains the worst natural catastrophe in the country's history. Estimates place the number of deaths between 66,000 and 70,000 people, most of them taken not by the quake itself, but by the enormous landslide that followed. But while the physical scars of the disaster have faded in many places, the memory lives on. In Yungay, a memorial sits where the town once stood, surrounded by flowers and the rusted remains of vehicles swallowed by the avalanche. It's quiet there now. But the story of that day in 1970 continues to be told, not just in Peru, but around the world, as a reminder of nature's power and the importance of being prepared. That day changed Peru forever, and the lessons it taught are still shaping how we face disasters today. In the autumn of 1979, meteorologists monitoring the Pacific Ocean began to notice the early signs of what would become one of the most powerful tropical cyclones in recorded history. It all started with a tropical disturbance near the Marshall Islands. At first, it seemed unremarkable, a cluster of thunderstorms brewing in warm ocean waters. But as the system began to organize, meteorologists could see it was no ordinary storm. The warm waters of the Pacific Ocean, combined with favorable atmospheric conditions, provided the perfect environment for the disturbance to develop. Sea surface temperatures in the region were unusually high, exceeding 80 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a vast reservoir of energy. At the same time, low wind shear, a condition where winds at different altitudes are not drastically different in speed or direction, allowed the storm to maintain its structure and grow rapidly. As the storm gathered strength, the Japan Meteorological Agency officially classified it as a tropical depression on October 8, 1979. By October 9th, it had intensified into a tropical storm, earning the name Tip. Over the next few days, Tip's growth was extraordinary. It transformed from a modest tropical storm into a full-fledged typhoon, its spiraling bands of clouds stretching farther and farther across the ocean. By October 11th, Tip reached the status of a super typhoon. At its peak, the storm boasted winds of over 190 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 870 millibars, the lowest ever recorded for a tropical cyclone. These figures alone make Typhoon Tip a meteorological marvel, but the storm's size was equally astonishing. At its largest, Tip's circulation spanned over 1,380 miles in diameter, making it the widest tropical cyclone ever documented. The immense size and power of Tip were not just theoretical measurements, they represented a serious threat to anyone in its path. Meteorologists faced the daunting challenge of predicting where the storm would go and how intense it would become. In an era without modern satellite imagery or advanced computer modeling, This task was as much an art as it was a science. Using weather balloons, aircraft reconnaissance, and early satellite data, they worked tirelessly to track Tip's progress. By mid-October, Tip had become a storm that defied imagination. Its enormous eye, a calm, eerily clear area at the center of the storm, measured over 20 miles across, surrounded by towering walls of clouds where the most violent winds and heaviest rains churned. This was the calm before the chaos, as the typhoon approached areas where its impact would be felt most acutely. Communities across the Western Pacific scrambled to prepare. In Japan and nearby islands like Guam, authorities issued evacuation orders, closed schools and businesses, and braced for the storm's arrival. People boarded up windows, secured their belongings, and sought refuge in designated shelters. Despite the best efforts of forecasters and officials, the sheer scale of Tip's power made it impossible to predict the exact extent of the destruction that lay ahead. Part 1 of this journey into Typhoon Tip's history ends here, with the storm at its peak intensity and a sense of unease hanging heavy over the Pacific. The next part will delve deeper into Tip's path and the impact of this colossal storm on the people and places in its way. As Typhoon Tip reached its peak intensity in mid-October of 1979, its immense size and power set it apart from any storm in recorded history. With its towering clouds, vast wind field, and record-breaking low pressure, Tip became a force of nature that demanded respect and fear. The storm's trajectory was closely monitored as forecasters worked tirelessly to predict its path and issue timely warnings to the regions at risk. Tip began its journey westward across the Pacific, its spiraling arms stretching out over 1,380 miles. The storm churned through open waters, gathering moisture and energy from the warm ocean surface. While the storm's eye remained a quiet center of calm, the surrounding eye wall was a region of unrelenting chaos. Wind speeds soared to over 190 miles per hour, accompanied by torrential rains that poured down in sheets, obscuring visibility and creating treacherous conditions for ships at sea. As the storm moved closer to land, the Japanese island of Guam found itself in Tip's vast outer reach. Although the island was spared a direct hit, it still faced strong winds, heavy rains, and rising seas. Coastal areas were inundated by storm surges, forcing evacuations and leaving residents grappling with power outages and flooded homes. Fishermen scrambled to secure their boats, and emergency responders worked around the clock to protect lives and property. While Guam experienced only a glancing blow, Japan's southern islands braced for the storm's full impact. Typhoon Tip shifted slightly northeast, sparing the most populated regions a direct hit, but still unleashing its fury on the Ryukyu Islands. Strong winds tore through towns, toppling trees and power lines, while torrential rains caused landslides that buried roads and threatened entire villages. At the same time, the storm's massive circulation caused ripple effects far beyond its immediate path. In the Philippines, hundreds of miles away, heavy rains brought by Tip's outer bands triggered flash floods and displaced thousands of families. The storm's sheer size meant that even areas not directly in its path felt its influence, underscoring the far-reaching impact of such a powerful system. Tip's eventual landfall came on October 19, 1979, in Japan's Shikoku region. By this point, the storm had weakened slightly from its record-setting peak, but it remained a formidable typhoon, with winds exceeding 120 miles per hour. Coastal towns bore the brunt of the storm surge, which swallowed entire stretches of shoreline, destroying homes and businesses in its wake. Farther inland, rivers swelled beyond their banks, inundating fields and towns and forcing thousands of residents to flee to higher ground. Throughout the chaos, stories of survival and resilience emerged. Families huddled together in shelters, clinging to hope as the storm raged outside. Emergency services worked tirelessly to rescue stranded residents, wading through floodwaters and navigating debris-strewn streets. The storm's impact on infrastructure was severe, with countless buildings reduced to rubble, roads rendered impassable, and communication networks disrupted. As Tip moved inland and began to lose strength, it left behind a trail of destruction that stretched for hundreds of miles. In the storm's wake, survivors emerged to assess the damage and begin the long process of recovery. Yet even as the winds died down and the rain subsided, the true scale of the disaster was only beginning to become clear. Next, we will explore the aftermath of Typhoon Tip, delving into the human toll, the challenges faced by those left in its path, and the lessons learned from this unprecedented storm. When Typhoon Tip finally dissipated in late October of 1979, the devastation left behind was staggering. Entire communities were unrecognizable, transformed by the relentless winds, rain, and storm surges that had accompanied the storm's passage. For the people who had endured its wrath, the aftermath was a time of reckoning, survival, and rebuilding. In Japan, the storm's impacts were most severe in the Shikoku and Honshu regions. Entire neighborhoods had been submerged by flooding, with homes and businesses reduced to soggy ruins. Farmlands, which were the lifeblood for many communities, were devastated as rivers overflowed, carrying away crops and livestock. Coastal towns suffered extensive damage, with fishing fleets destroyed and ports rendered unusable. One of the most immediate concerns was the displacement of thousands of residents. Shelters quickly filled with families seeking refuge, many of whom had lost everything. In the days following the storm, emergency response teams worked tirelessly to deliver food, clean water, and medical aid to the affected areas. However, the sheer scale of the disaster made it a daunting task. Roads were blocked by landslides and debris, making it difficult for supplies to reach remote locations. The human toll of the storm was deeply felt. Dozens of lives were lost, and many more were injured. Hospitals were overwhelmed with patients suffering from storm-related injuries, and there was a growing concern about the spread of waterborne diseases due to the contaminated floodwaters. Volunteers and aid organizations rallied to support those in need, but the emotional scars of the disaster were evident in every survivor's story. Beyond the immediate challenges, the long-term effects of Tip were profound. Infrastructure across the region was severely damaged, with roads, bridges, and power lines needing extensive repairs. In some areas, it took weeks or even months to restore electricity and clean water. Schools and public buildings that had been used as evacuation centers required significant renovations before they could reopen. Environmental damage was another pressing issue. Forests along the typhoon's path were left in shambles, with uprooted trees scattered like matchsticks. Coastal erosion altered the landscape, and the storm's intense rainfall led to soil destabilization, increasing the risk of future landslides. Efforts to clean up and repair the damage required coordination between local governments, national agencies, and international aid organizations. As the recovery unfolded, stories of resilience and solidarity emerged. Communities banded together to clear debris, rebuild homes, and support one another through the hardships. Local leaders organized fundraisers and donation drives, while neighboring regions sent resources and manpower to assist in the recovery efforts. Despite the immense challenges, there was a collective determination to overcome the disaster and restore a sense of normalcy. In the months that followed, meteorologists and scientists analyzed Typhoon Tip's unprecedented strength and impact. Its record-breaking size and intensity highlighted the need for improved forecasting technology and disaster preparedness. Governments across the Pacific region began reassessing their emergency response strategies, seeking to learn from Tip's devastating lessons to better protect their citizens in the future. As we wrap up, we will reflect on the legacy of Typhoon Tip, examining how it changed our understanding of tropical cyclones and the ongoing quest to predict and mitigate such powerful forces of nature. Typhoon Tip's story did not end when its winds subsided or the floodwaters receded. Instead, the storm left an enduring legacy, one that reshaped our understanding of tropical cyclones and the ways we prepare for natural disasters. In the decades since Tip's unprecedented arrival in 1979, its lessons have influenced meteorology, disaster management, and public awareness in profound ways. One of the most significant impacts of Typhoon Tip was its contribution to meteorological science. At the time, the storm's size and intensity were unparalleled, pushing scientists to study its unique characteristics. Researchers examined how Tip's interaction with warm ocean waters and atmospheric conditions created the perfect environment for such a colossal storm to form. This research not only deepened our understanding of typhoon dynamics, but also helped improve predictive models, enabling forecasters to anticipate storm behavior with greater accuracy. Tip also highlighted the importance of advancements in storm monitoring technology. In the late 1970s, satellite imagery was still in its early stages, and weather data collection relied heavily on reconnaissance aircraft and surface observations. The challenges of tracking Tip underscored the need for more robust satellite systems which have since become essential tools in monitoring tropical cyclones worldwide. Today, meteorologists can track storms in real time, providing earlier warnings and saving countless lives. On a societal level, TIP served as a wake-up call for disaster preparedness. Communities and governments across the Pacific Basin recognize the critical importance of early warning systems, evacuation protocols, and infrastructure resilience. In Japan, where the storm's impact was most severe, efforts were made to strengthen coastal defenses, improve flood management systems, and educate the public on how to respond to typhoons. These measures have undoubtedly reduced the toll of subsequent storms in the region. The human stories of Typhoon Tip, of loss, resilience, and recovery, also played a pivotal role in fostering a deeper appreciation for the power of nature. Survivors' accounts of the storm's fury and its aftermath served as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of coastal communities. These narratives helped galvanize support for stronger disaster response programs and greater investment in community preparedness. Globally, TIP's record-breaking intensity became a benchmark in the study of tropical cyclones. The storm's name remains synonymous with extreme weather, and its place in history has influenced how we perceive and respond to similar events. It also spurred international collaboration among scientists, governments, and organizations working together to mitigate the impacts of future storms. While Typhoon Tip was a natural disaster of immense destruction, its legacy is also one of progress and resilience. The storm's unprecedented power challenged humanity to rise to the occasion, to learn from the devastation, and to build a future where we are better equipped to face the forces of nature. The advancements in meteorology, disaster management, and community preparedness that followed in TIP's wake stand as a testament to our ability to adapt and endure. As we reflect on the history of Typhoon Tip, we are reminded of the duality of nature's beauty and its potential for destruction. It is a call to action to respect the environment, prepare for the unpredictable, and remain steadfast in the face of adversity. Typhoon Tip may have been a storm of the past, but its lessons are timeless, serving as a guide for navigating the storms of the future. The early hours of July 28, 1976 seem no different from any other summer morning in Tangshan, a growing industrial city in northeastern China. Positioned in Hebei province, Tangshan was home to approximately 1 million people, many of whom were miners, factory workers, and their families. Life hummed along with an air of routine. Few could have imagined that this ordinary day would soon become etched in history as the setting for one of the deadliest earthquakes of the 20th century. At precisely 3:42 a.m., an earthquake struck with a magnitude of 7.5 on the Richter scale. Its epicenter was located just 12 kilometers beneath the surface, a shallow depth that would amplify its destructive power. The region's geological makeup played a critical role in the disaster. Tangshan was situated on loose sedimentary soil, which exacerbated the seismic waves as they radiated outward. These amplified tremors turned the earth beneath the city into a rolling, heaving force of devastation. Adding to the catastrophe, Tangshan's urban development was not prepared for such a seismic event. The city lacked earthquake-resistant infrastructure, and many of its buildings were constructed from unreinforced masonry and other substandard materials. This left them vulnerable to collapse under the earthquake's immense force. When the quake struck, entire city blocks were razed in seconds, leaving little standing in its wake. The immediate aftermath was horrifying. Entire families were buried beneath rubble as buildings crumbled like sandcastles. Streets buckled, bridges snapped, and water mains ruptured, flooding parts of the city and making rescue efforts even more challenging. The ground itself became a hazard as fissures opened up, swallowing anything or anyone in their path. Communication lines were severed, isolating Tangshan from the outside world and delaying the flow of critical information about the scale of the disaster. The timing of the earthquake added to the tragedy. Striking while most residents were asleep in their homes, the death toll skyrocketed as people were caught completely off guard. Survivors later recounted how they were jolted awake by violent shaking, only to be engulfed by collapsing walls and falling debris. Darkness, chaos, and confusion overwhelmed the city as cries for help echoed into the night. Despite its seismic significance, there were no foreshocks to serve as a warning. While some animals reportedly exhibited unusual behavior in the hours before the quake, such as dogs barking incessantly and livestock acting erratically, these signs were not enough to prompt human action. This absence of clear warning further underscores the unexpected nature of the disaster. In the hours following the quake, Tangshan's true plight remained hidden from the world. Limited communication and China's tightly controlled media meant that the full scale of the disaster would not emerge immediately. For now, Tangshan's residents were left to grapple with the immense destruction and loss, unaided and largely unnoticed by the outside world. This marked the beginning of a disaster whose ripple effects would extend far beyond its epicenter, reshaping disaster response, preparedness, and urban planning in China and beyond. As the clock struck 3:42 in the early hours of late July, the peaceful city of Tangshan, still shrouded in the stillness of night, was torn apart by a seismic upheaval unlike anything its residents had experienced. The earthquake's force was swift, brutal, and uncompromising, generating seismic waves that spread destruction across a staggering area of over 3,000 square kilometers. The ground heaved violently, transforming solid earth into a liquid-like phenomenon known as soil liquefaction, a catastrophic process that caused buildings to tilt, sink, or collapse entirely. While the epicenter was located within Tangshan, the earthquake's effects radiated far beyond the city. Surrounding towns and rural areas were hit hard, with entire communities flattened in mere seconds. Structures ranging from modest village homes to industrial facilities crumbled under their relentless vibrations. The region's coal mines, a vital part of Tangshan's economy, were particularly devastated, trapping hundreds of workers underground. For those miners, survival became a race against time as tunnels caved in, cutting off both air and escape routes. The damage extended to critical infrastructure, further compounding the chaos. Railways were twisted into grotesque shapes, severing vital transportation links. Power plants were rendered inoperable, plunging the area into darkness, while water pipelines shattered, leaving survivors without clean water. Bridges that once connected the city to nearby regions were reduced to piles of twisted steel and concrete, isolating Tangshan further from external aid. One of the earthquake's most haunting aspects was its sheer speed. Experts later estimated that the most intense shaking lasted less than 15 seconds, yet the destruction it wrought was monumental. This brevity meant that those who might have reacted to the tremors had virtually no time to escape. Survivors described the moments of impact as akin to an apocalyptic storm, walls collapsing, roofs caving in, and the air filling with a deafening roar as the ground moved beneath them. Adding to the horror, the earthquake struck during a heat wave, compounding the physical and emotional toll on survivors. Temperatures soared, and without shelter, clean water, or medical supplies, conditions rapidly deteriorated. Many were forced to endure the blistering heat while searching for loved ones or trying to rescue neighbors trapped beneath the rubble. The sweltering conditions also accelerated the decomposition of bodies, posing significant health risks and further traumatizing those who remained. Another tragic element of the disaster was the widespread loss of life among children. Many schools in Tangshan were not built to withstand even minor earthquakes, let alone a seismic event of this magnitude. As a result, countless young lives were lost when classrooms collapsed, burying students and teachers under tons of debris. These heart-wrenching scenes left an indelible scar on the community and would later fuel demands for stricter building regulations and earthquake preparedness. Meanwhile, survivors faced a terrifying landscape of ruin. Fires broke out across the city as ruptured gas lines ignited, creating an additional hazard for those navigating the wreckage. The air became thick with smoke, dust, and the cries of those in pain or mourning their losses. Every moment was a test of resilience as individuals banded together to lift debris, carry the injured to makeshift medical stations, or dig with their bare hands in desperate attempts to find loved ones. Despite the enormity of the disaster, Tangshan's plight initially remained largely unknown to the outside world. The destruction of communication lines and the isolated nature of the region created a chilling silence that left even neighboring cities unaware of the unfolding tragedy. For the people of Tangshan, this isolation deepened their sense of abandonment, as it became clear that immediate help was not on the way. These early hours marked a critical juncture in what would become one of history's most significant natural disasters, setting the stage for an unparalleled story of survival, loss, and resilience. The devastation caused by the Tangshan earthquake unfolded on an almost unimaginable scale. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, creating a vast expanse of destruction where homes, schools, factories, and hospitals once stood. Over 90% of the city's buildings were either damaged or completely destroyed, leaving the majority of Tangshan's population without shelter. The widespread collapse of infrastructure compounded the chaos, forcing survivors to confront a harsh and unforgiving reality in the earthquake's immediate aftermath. The industrial heart of Tangshan, once a bustling hub of economic activity, was obliterated. Factories that powered the region's economy lay in ruins, and heavy machinery was scattered like toys across the landscape. Among the hardest hit were coal mines, which suffered catastrophic collapses, burying hundreds of workers deep underground. These miners faced a desperate battle for survival, contending with toxic gas, flooding, and the ever-present risk of further cave-ins. Hospitals and medical facilities critical for treating the injured were not spared. Most were destroyed, and those that remained operational were overwhelmed within hours. Makeshift medical centers sprang up in open fields and among the debris, staffed by a few doctors and nurses who survived. Supplies of antibiotics, painkillers, and bandages were woefully inadequate, forcing medical workers to improvise treatments and prioritize the most critical cases. With the injured numbering in the tens of thousands, triage became a grim and inescapable task. Amidst the destruction, survivors faced immense challenges in securing basic necessities. Access to clean water was nearly non-existent, as pipelines had been shattered and wells contaminated. Food supplies dwindled rapidly, leaving many to scavenge through the wreckage or share meager rations. The summer heat exacerbated these hardships, with temperatures soaring above 37 degrees Celsius, further threatening the health of those already weakened by injury or exhaustion. Survivors banded together in an incredible display of human resilience and solidarity. Men, women, and even children took part in rescue efforts. Using bare hands and simple tools to dig through the rubble, makeshift teams formed spontaneously, driven by the shared hope of finding loved ones alive beneath the debris. Tragically, the majority of those trapped could not be saved, as the sheer scale of destruction and the lack of heavy rescue equipment hindered these efforts. The earthquake also inflicted devastating emotional wounds. Families were torn apart as countless lives were lost in an instant. The grief of those who survived was compounded by the uncertainty surrounding the fate of their loved ones. Makeshift memorials began appearing within days, with survivors placing flowers, candles, and personal mementos near the sites where friends and family had perished. Adding to the catastrophe, aftershocks continued to terrorize the region. These tremors, some significant in their own right, caused further collapses and heightened the fear of those already traumatized by the initial quake. For the residents of Tangshan, the ground beneath them seemed permanently unstable, and each aftershock was a cruel reminder of their vulnerability. As word of the disaster began to spread beyond Tangshan, nearby towns and villages grappled with their own losses. The destruction was not confined to the city alone. Smaller communities were equally devastated, though their struggles often went unnoticed in the shadow of Tangshan's catastrophe. These areas faced similar shortages of water, food, and medical supplies, further straining the limited resources available for relief efforts. In these early days, survival was a test of willpower and ingenuity. The residents of Tangshan and its surrounding areas displayed extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable adversity, setting the stage for a long and arduous recovery. The city's ruins bore silent witness to the resilience of its people, even as the true scope of the disaster was only beginning to emerge. In the months and years following the Tangshan earthquake, the true extent of the disaster became a defining moment in modern Chinese history. The challenges of rebuilding a shattered city, addressing the emotional scars of survivors, and honoring the memory of those lost created a legacy that would shape Tangshan and its people for generations. The Chinese government launched an unprecedented reconstruction effort. Within days of the disaster, engineers and construction crews from across the country descended on Tangshan. Entire neighborhoods were cleared of debris, and temporary shelters were erected to house the displaced population. Despite limited resources, the reconstruction process reflected a commitment to rebuilding not just the city's infrastructure, but its spirit. By the early 1980s, Tangshan began to transform into a symbol of resilience and recovery, with new buildings rising in place of the ruins. Public health initiatives also became a cornerstone of the post-disaster response. The widespread destruction of hospitals and sanitation facilities had led to fears of disease outbreaks. Medical teams worked tirelessly to vaccinate survivors and improve living conditions in temporary camps. Over time, Tangshan emerged as a model for public health planning in the aftermath of disasters, influencing emergency response strategies across China. For the survivors, the earthquake left deep psychological wounds. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of the disaster. Community support networks played a crucial role in helping individuals process their grief. Over the years, storytelling, art, and cultural events became powerful tools for healing, allowing survivors to share their experiences and honor the memories of loved ones. The Tangshan earthquake also catalyzed advancements in earthquake research and preparedness. The scale of destruction highlighted the need for improved building standards and stricter enforcement of construction codes. By the 1990s, Tangshan's new structures were built to withstand earthquakes, reflecting lessons learned from the tragedy. The disaster also spurred the development of early warning systems and a nationwide focus on earthquake education, which have since saved countless lives. Globally, the Tangshan earthquake drew attention to the importance of international solidarity in the face of natural disasters. Although China largely relied on internal resources, offers of aid from other countries marked a significant shift in global disaster response dynamics. The tragedy underscored the shared vulnerability of humanity and the need for collective action to mitigate the impact of such events. In Tangshan today, memorials stand as a testament to the lives lost and the resilience of those who survived. The Tangshan Earthquake Memorial Park, completed in the late 20th century, is a place of reflection and remembrance. Its design incorporates remnants of destroyed buildings and poignant sculptures, ensuring that the memory of the disaster remains alive for future generations. The earthquake also left an indelible mark on Chinese culture. It inspired literature, film, and academic studies, shaping the way disasters are understood and discussed. The stories of survival and courage from Tangshan resonate far beyond the city, serving as a reminder of humanity's strength in the face of unimaginable loss. As the decades have passed, Tangshan has risen from its darkest moment to become a thriving city once again. Its recovery is a testament to the resilience of its people, the power of community, and the lessons learned from one of history's most devastating natural disasters. The legacy of the Tangshan earthquake is not merely one of destruction, but also of rebuilding, healing, and hope for a better future.